It's that time of the week where Yaffee talks with an expert that is a voice of reason in a world that is beyond reason. This is the Beyond Reason radio interview of the week.
On this week's edition of the Beyond Reason radio interview of the week, I actually did something a little different. I found someone who gives her take on the millennial generation from the left side. I'm obviously the voice of the millennial generation, especially from the right side, but this person wants to speak for the left side. So this is her take. I talk about her take on what the millennials are thinking, which I obviously disagree a lot with. But this can actually kind of open your eyes to what millennials on the left side are thinking, why I get behind the microphone and talk about the things I do. Because the misrepresentations of something that we are against Islam, we are just for foreign wars, we're against students, and so forth. It shows that the millennials maybe are as divided as any other group. But I think a lot, even though she thinks differently, I think a lot of millennials are going to be attracted more to individual freedom of conservatives and libertarians. And so we have a conversation here, and then maybe in future shows I'll talk a little bit more about why I disagree with her. But it's very eye-opening to have a conversation with someone like this in our generation and how they think and how different it is from, I think, a lot of millennials think. You are listening to another edition of the Beyond Reason Radio interview of the week. And this week I am joined by Amanda Gutterman, who is the editorial director at Slant, which you can find at slantnews.com. And she's going to be talking to me today about what the millennials think about the terrorist attacks in Paris. And Amanda, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, obviously, with the horrific terrorist attacks, that's been taking a lot of the news attention out there. But I am very curious, as a millennial myself, what does my generation think about these attacks? How are we reacting to them?
Well, I run a crowdsourced journalism platform that a lot of millennials turn to share their opinions on what's going on in the world. And one of the things I've been seeing overwhelmingly is a fear that this attack ends up translating into more hate, more discrimination, and more anti-Muslim, anti-Islam rhetoric. This should be an event that brings us together to mourn and to celebrate the heroic and generous acts that people did in Paris, to figure out a way to address the divisions in our society and the hopelessness that leads people, young men and women, to want to join ISIS, to be able to address that without hate, without fear, and in a way that brings people together rather than using warlike, angry rhetoric to drive us further apart.
Now, you said we should focus on some of the heroic things from Parisians during the attacks. Do you have any examples of any heroic deeds?
Absolutely. So, for example, so I actually lived in the 11th arrondissement during my semester abroad in college.
Oh, wow.
Okay. It's a place full of young people, full of progressive views. It's actually a place near the Sorbonne, which is one of the biggest public universities in France. And a lot of the fifth, where the Sorbonne is pretty expensive, but the 11th is a little bit more affordable. And so a lot of folks live there, a lot of young people, a lot of people in school, progressive minds. And one of the things that I noticed on social media, which I was following really closely the night of the attacks, was that this hashtag sprang up in my old neighborhood called Porte Ouverte. And if you don't speak French, that means open door, or the door is open here. And it was an invitation to anybody who might be in the streets or far from home or who might be a visitor to come and find safety and shelter in another person's home instead of being out on the streets where people thought it was dangerous. So that was one really beautiful moment to come out of this. And the day after the attacks, friends of mine assembled on the Place de la République, which is a really important, central place in Paris. And they were singing Let It Be. They were singing Beatles songs. They were turning to love rather than fear, even as the rhetoric of some politicians swirling around them has done the opposite.
And what is some of that rhetoric when you say there's anti-Muslim rhetoric, for example. I mean, what are they saying?
Yeah, so we've seen statements coming out of a lot of the political campaigns for 2016 already, saying, it's time to stop calling this anything other than a war on Islam. After 9/11, the amount of discrimination against Muslim people, Muslim citizens living in the United States, went through the roof. And one would think we'd learn from that experience. We entered into a horrific war. We had a knee-jerk reaction, which ended up losing us, our sons and daughters, a ton of money, and a complete waste in every possible way. It feels like we're reacting the same way. We're reacting with calls for hate, calls for discrimination, words against Islam in general, when many, it shouldn't even need to be said that ISIS is different from Islam. But that's what we're hearing from some political figures, both in France and in the U.S.
Well, I have heard a lot about we should call it radical Islam. How should we phrase it then? I mean, I heard in the Democrat debate as well, they're called jihadists. That's what they've been calling them. These are radical jihadists. Some are saying radical Islam. What is the best way? I mean, what should we call the enemy? Do we just call them ISIS?
I mean, I see no particular reason to call them something other than ISIS fighters or to use any sort of language that would drive any kind of wedge between Muslim populations of our allies and our countries and everyone else. I think that any language that serves to do that is problematic. I think probably the way to do it is to talk to the Muslim anti-defamation organizations in the U.S. and in Paris, and to figure out what they're comfortable with and to work in tandem with those individuals who are being impacted to try and find a way to bring people together.
All right, and specifically on millennials, how do you feel millennials? I mean, you say you've seen a lot of the rhetoric, the Islam rhetoric, but what do you see specifically from millennials? Are we just as divided as everyone else on this issue?
No, I mean, millennials tend to be not tied to a political party, not Democrats, not Republicans, but on the social front, they tend to be progressive. They've met people who are Muslims. They've met people who are different from them, or they are Muslim themselves, and they are really against the idea that this would happen, and then the reaction would be blanket hatred against a group of people. I think millennials really recognize that blaming this attack on Islam is the wrong move, and that it's just that kind of divisiveness within a society that drives people to the fringes and the margins, and that makes people susceptible to something like joining ISIS.
All right, and since we've been talking about some of the candidates and what they're saying, I did want to get your take on where millennials are shifting in terms of the presidential campaign in both parties. I mean, is there someone in the Republican Party and someone in the Democrat Party that you feel that millennials are really attracted to?
Yeah, so, I mean, some of the real energy behind the Bernie Sanders campaign has come from millennials who are really attracted to his views, especially on free college tuition and on student debt. Student debt is a huge issue that impacts millennials more than any other generation in American history. And they're really looking for a candidate that is able to address that concern. The problem with that is that Bernie Sanders is probably not going to get the Democratic nomination, so it's going to be Hillary's challenge to see if she can win the Sanders millennial voter.
Do you think she can?
I think she can win me, and she can win every other millennial if she creates a policy that benefits us financially with regard to student debt.
And I know she has a plan.
I think the same goes for any Republican. I think student debt, climate, progressive social issues, things like the wage gap, the gender wage gap, racial discrimination. I think progressive social issues coupled with a real address of climate change, coupled with policies that allow us to climb out from under student debt, I think that's what millennials are looking for in a candidate.
Well, I know Hillary Clinton did propose an idea of more spending to help students finance their student debt, but I guess the main question I have then is, aren't the millennials going to be the ones paying for that in the long run? through their taxes because we're already in a lot of debt. So if millennials support that now, I mean, aren't they going to be paying for it in the future?
I think that's a very simple view of it. I think that we can be allocating government resources toward helping millennials get out of debt and stop allocating government resources toward other things instead. So, for example, financing expensive foreign wars that don't work. That would be a great way to cut back, many millennials think, and to spend that money instead on making sure that things are solvent domestically with their student debt. Just saying that the government should help students with debt isn't necessarily saying that they're going to end up paying more long term in order to have that policy take place. It's a give and take.
I got you. So with you, it's about what the government should be involved in and what it shouldn't be. And to you, it seems like it should be more involved in things like student debt rather than wars. But
I speak on the behalf of millennials who write for my site who seem to care overwhelmingly about student debt and who would rather government be spending less money on the military involvement in other countries.
Well, I mean, it's definitely a big issue with millennials. Then the last question I have to ask is how, if we're not spending, like you said, on foreign wars, how do we fight ISIS? If we are not spending them on the military in that, or is there a different way to fight ISIS, or is the military already funded enough to fight it that we don't have to fund it even more, as you said?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, as a lot of people who know a lot about, ISIS know and recognize that ISIS was born out of our involvement in the Iraq War. And that I'm not a general, I'm not a military expert, but having a knee-jerk reaction to something like 9/11 and having a huge, expensive foreign war that was seen as an invasion and that changed the perception of America all through the world in the Middle East, that's what created and gave birth to ISIS. And I think we need to be vigilant in our approach, even now, that we're seen in the world not in the right way, so that we aren't just doing their job for them by playing into exactly how they want us to act and be perceived.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I'm just kind of curious. So how should we react? I guess is what I'm wondering. Do you have any ideas of your own of what our reaction should be?
I'm not a general. I don't have a military strategy. I don't have a plan like that. But what I know is that we can't repeat the mistakes of 9/11 and launch into a huge foreign war that ends up making people hate us and playing exactly into what ISIS wants us to do.
Right. All right. Any last words about where you see the millennial generation going?
I mean, I see them as really up for grabs. They don't believe in Republicans and Democrats. They really care about the issues. And I think any candidate could really get them on board if they start proposing financial policies that are in line with millennials' actual interests. I think that the only way for millennials to actually get more financial policies made in their interest is to come out and vote in larger numbers. Millennials have traditionally been a pretty low voter turnout group. And
now, I was just going to say, is that, low turnout, is that just because they were younger? I mean, is that a usual trend with young people, or are millennials even less likely to vote?
So a few different reasons why I hear from millennials that they're not likely to vote. They think that their vote doesn't matter, that there are just so many people voting that theirs is a needle in a haystack. They don't have time. Oftentimes they have hourly jobs, things that you can't, take time from as easily in order to go vote, or they're not getting the day off. Or they're in school. They can't miss classes. They can't miss homework. There's so much more. They don't have the security to take that time away to go and vote, or they feel that they're a needle in the haystack. And I would encourage them as much as possible to really go vote, to wield the tool that has been given to them to have their opinions matter. Because even if they go and they write in Donald Duck, that's one more millennial person demographically who's going in and voting. And the more millennials vote, the more you'll see politicians creating policies that target their interests. If you listen to the last GOP debate, you could have called that debate the AARP debate. They were talking to older people because older people are the folks who are coming out and voting for them. If that were millennials voting at that high a number, they would have been talking to millennials.
I will have to say, I know you probably have to go soon, but in terms of the GOP debate, it does seem that there's one candidate, and I would say Marco Rubio, who's at least trying to get to the younger vote in terms of, he's saying his campaign is the next American century. And I mean, do you see that at all in him, that he might be, if they lean Republican?
And I've actually said that Rubio from the beginning has had my bet to be the Republican contender. I mean,
Right.
I don't think that young people are too excited by Donald Trump and Ben Carson. I think a lot of their xenophobic and anti-progressive, anti-women views, anti-Muslim have struck the wrong chord. Meanwhile, Rubio's progressive agenda with, relatively more open agenda with regard to immigration, and his youthful face, his social media abilities have definitely, opened the door to the idea that Rubio might be a candidate millennials and conservative-leaning millennials might favor.
All right. Thank you, Amanda, for joining me, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.